Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to part two of equilibrium supply and demand. If you remember in part one, we talked about putting both the supply curves and the demand curves on the same graph so that we could determine the equilibrium point, which is the point on the graph where the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded meet, the intersection of those two curves, and how that also results in identifying what's called an equilibrium price. We talked about how the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity provide the highest total revenue for the supplier, while also supplying the highest total satisfaction for the consumer. We looked at how the equilibrium point changes with left and right shifts in both supply and demand curves, and looked at some of the effects that changes in pricing cause, specifically when prices are set above or below the equilibrium price. Prices set above equilibrium price result in um, surplus production, whereas prices set below the equilibrium price frequently result in shortages as demand outstrips the supply. So that's how the free market causes equilibrium to bounce around, and how the market is constantly searching for that equilibrium point. Today, we are actually going to take that one step further, and we're going to start looking at what happens when the outside forces start artificially adjusting either the price or the quantity, um, whether supplied or demanded, and the impacts that these artificial adjustments have on um, both supply and demand. And we're going to start by talking about rationing. Um, Basic definitions. Rationing very simply means controlling the supply. And we control the supply by a number of factors. We can do it by artificially limiting the supply. We can do it by artificially boosting the supply, but we can also do it by artificially adjusting the demand, either cutting the demand back or increasing the demand. And when we talk about rationing, what rationing is used for is it's generally used to force a change in the market dynamics beyond what would be possible through the free market exercise of the marketplace in total. And you might ask yourself, why would we ration anything? Why would we mess with free market dynamics that way? And there are a number of different reasons. One of the biggest reasons is, believe it or not, political favoritism. If you look at, for example, certain U.S. industries, sometimes the U.S. as an industry where the cost of production is high enough that the United States producers can't necessarily compete against cheaper foreign imports. The steel industry in Pittsburgh, for example, had a hard time competing against the influx of much less expensive Japanese steel. And as a result, um, you might notice that the industry in Pittsburgh has kind of faded away. We don't really do a lot of steel production there anymore. So the government, as a political favor to the U.S. steel industry, might force a ration, in this case, a limit on the amount of foreign steel that could be imported in order to help boost that U.S. production. It could be based on favoritism. It could be based on brute force. One set of producers trying to drive another set of producers out of business, or one set of producers trying to corner a market to basically get 100% of the demand on their side. Rationing might be based on what's called a first come, first serve basis, where first person through the door has the willingness and ability. Remember, those are the two things necessary in a marketplace: the willingness and ability to buy 100% of the quantity supplied. And we might ration because we want to spread that out among multiple consumers. So there are several different reasons for why a rationing tool would be used. And in general, when it comes to rationing, we look at one of four things. We can look at what's called a price ceiling or a price floor, which are controls on the price of goods outside of consideration for the equilibrium point. And we'll look at both price ceilings and price floors in just a few minutes. But we can also look at adjustments to quantity. And with adjustments to quantity, it's adjustments to quantity supplied or quantity demanded. So an adjustment to quantity supplied is where we set either a minimum or a maximum amount that the supplier is allowed to produce. When we limit demand, we're setting a limit on the amount that consumers are allowed to purchase. And you can see from the cartoon there on the right, where they're talking about bottled water during a drought. When I taught this class last year, we had a hurricane that had gone through Florida, and consequently a lot of damage to the infrastructure down there. Some of the damage was to the fixtures that carry drinking water to houses and businesses, and so consequently bottled water was in high demand because the water coming out of the tap was not necessarily safe to drink. And what we saw was a sharp increase in the price of bottled water. This is because demand for the bottled water increased at every price. The demand curve literally shifted from its normal level to the right at every price. People were desperate for water, and they were willing to buy more bottled water regardless of the price point. So the demand curve shifted hard right, and as we saw from the video yesterday, when the demand curve shifts hard right, that equilibrium point ends up, sorry, I'm shifting the supply curve. When the demand curve shifts hard right, we see that equilibrium point slide up the supply curve, and the equilibrium price is going to increase naturally. And that's part of the market force because the producers have the same amount of bottled water available, more people want more water, the price is going to increase. Now, the reason that I mention that is because there are cases where the price increased well above what would have been the equilibrium price. But there were also cases of people that were going in and buying huge stockpiles of the bottled water before the price increases became too big, and then would turn around and sell that water at a profit. And both of these practices constitute a type of rationing. But as you see in the red print there in the bottom of the page, where I've got price gouging highlighted in red, that means it's important. I want it understood that from an economist point of view, there is no such thing as price gouging. Price gouging is a term used for political or social purposes. It is used to express a dissatisfaction with increases in the market price of goods in high demand. And it's used to try to inflame emotions to get people to artificially cap, to set a ration in the form of a price cap on certain goods or services that are temporarily or artificially in high demand. So the government will come in and they will identify a price increase that may be simply in accordance with market forces driving up the equilibrium price. The government will call it price gouging, and they will pass a law that prevents the price increase from taking place, effectively adding a price ceiling on those goods or services. And the question becomes, is price gouging really a bad thing? And the answer is maybe, maybe not. Um, Price gouging, or a movement towards a higher equilibrium price, is actually a rationing tool in its own right. And the reason that I mention it here is, I think I've got it on the next slide. I do. Well, I got this. Um, when prices start to go up, look at the toilet paper issue with the current pandemic. Before any price increases on toilet paper, people heard there might be a quarantine. They went running into Walmart and, oh my God, there's 2 pallet loads of toilet paper still selling for yesterday's price, and they buy up all 2 pallets. Now they've got enough toilet paper to last them 3 years. In the meantime, the second guy coming through the door can't buy toilet paper at any price because there's none on the shelf. So what price gouging or extreme price increases do is it institutes a form of rationing. I might be willing to buy 50 packages of toilet paper when it's selling for $10 a package. I might not be willing to buy 50 packages of toilet paper when it's selling for $100 a package. I still need the toilet paper, and I might be willing to buy 1 package of toilet paper at $100 and take my chances that toilet paper will be available a month from now when that package runs out. But what it did is it forced me to buy less because I was not willing on the demand curve. I was not willing to buy more quantity at the higher price. I was willing to buy the entire quantity at the lower price, but at the higher price, I'm only going to buy what I need at that moment. And what that does then is it actually forces consumers to reduce their demand artificially as a form of rationing. How does that work? Well, here we go. Let's look at our supply and demand curves. And we're going to start with supply 1 and demand 1. Those are the same curves that we've been working with all through this lesson. And our equilibrium price point was here at $55. And our equilibrium quantity was here at 43 units. Now, rumors of a pandemic and a pending quarantine come out, and they cause a panic in the population. So the demand, here's demand 2, the demand curve shifts right, meaning consumers are willing to buy more at every price. So even though I wouldn't pay $100 for a pack of toilet paper then, only selling 10 packs, the new quantity demanded at $100 is 30. The entire demand curve has shifted 20 units to the right. Now, the supply curve at this point has not changed. So let's look at what happens to that equilibrium price. Here's the old equilibrium price, $55. As the supply curve shifted to the right, the new intersection became $70. So at $70, Walmart raises its price on toilet paper from $55 to $70 because that's the equilibrium price. And the same number of people that were buying at 55 are now buying at 70. Because the suppliers see this quantity demanded, and also look at this. I've got a higher demand, almost, what is that, about 48 units? Because they've seen that price increase, all of a sudden, suppliers are now going to step up supply. demand has increased across the board. Suppliers go, hey, there's an opportunity to increase revenue here. The supply curve shifts to the right. Maybe there's some companies out there that are making stationery, which nobody uses anymore because everyone uses email. And they shift their production from making envelopes to making toilet paper. And so much more supply becomes available at every price. When the supply curve shifts right, look at what happens to that equilibrium point. The price went up to $70 and then supply started shifting right. And when the curve shifted right, that equilibrium point slid down the new demand curve. Demand is still high and quantity supplied is still high. Under the original numbers, 43 was the equilibrium quantity. But at the new numbers, with the right shift in both curves, quantity is now 63. 20 units higher being supplied and purchased. But the price has dropped back to that original equilibrium price of $55. Had we, in fact, slapped a price ceiling on there to prevent price gouging, the supply curve would never have shifted to the right. Demand would be over here at $55. Supply would still be here at 43. So 43 supplied, 63 demanded, and this becomes our shortage based on the artificial price cap. And that's why price gouging, as I said, it's a phrase designed to inflame emotions, but it's not really a bad thing. It forces a new equilibrium price. It reduces quantity at the higher price, quantity demanded at the higher price, while promoting the upkeep or increase of quantity supplied at the higher price. And as quantity supplied increases to meet the quantity demanded, the equilibrium price will eventually settle back down to a market norm as that equilibrium price first increases and then decreases back to normal. Look at what happens if I artificially price cap something, or if I artificially restrict that supply. Any restriction in the supply is going to cause the supply curve to shift left. Less product supplied at every price. My demand curve is still a right shift. I still got people panic buying toilet paper out there. The supply curve has shifted left. You're not letting me increase my price to maximize my revenue. Therefore, I am not inclined to increase production. In fact, I might actually decrease production because there are other things that I have going on that might be more profitable. Maybe a toilet paper factory actually converts to making envelopes. So that supply curve shifts left. Look at what happens to my new demand and my old supply. Look, the equilibrium price at $70, but now you're telling me I can't charge $70. And my supply curve, as it shifts left, that price, that equilibrium price actually rises to $90. The equilibrium price does, but I've set a price cap at 55 in order to prevent price gouging. And at $55 on that new supply curve, my producers have actually reduced their production from the old equilibrium quantity of 43. They've actually reduced it down to about 21. Now, at $55, I've got 63 people over here that want to buy toilet paper and are actually willing to pay $70 a pack for it. But over here, my suppliers are only supplying 22 rolls. So I got 41 people who cannot purchase toilet paper at any price, which means the gap between this point and this point becomes my shortage. So price gouging, if we allow the market to move and we allow that supposed gouging price to rise to the equilibrium price, the supply curve is either going to remain the same or it's going to shift to the right as supply increases. And that equilibrium price, after a period of time, is going to fall back down into the normal range. And in the meantime, I've prevented one person from going into the store and buying out all of a product by having a higher price on it. Now, there is another way that you can do that, and it's a rationing method that the government took, actually implemented during World War II. But you've probably seen it in stores around the area where there'll be a really good price on a product. Maybe they're having a sale or something. And you go in, you want to buy a whole case of hand sanitizer, but you get to the hand sanitizer aisle, and while it's stocked, there's a sign on the shelf, and it says limit 2 bottles per customer. So I can artificially ration demand from the consumer perspective by saying it doesn't matter how much you're willing to purchase. It doesn't matter how much you're able to purchase. We're going to artificially limit your ability to purchase to 2. And this sometimes works. In World War II, they did it with gasoline and a number of other products that were being used by the military, silk for parachutes, processed food for combat rations, so on and so forth. But with gasoline in particular, the government came down and said, you're going to have a ration of gasoline, a weekly amount of gasoline that you're allowed to purchase based on how important you are to the wartime economy and what you need the gasoline for. So they were encouraging people to carpool. They were encouraging people to take public transportation. But if you absolutely had to have your vehicle for a job, you were issued a gas ration based partially on what you were using your vehicle for, but also on how much that use contributed to the war effort. So if you were a traveling vacuum cleaner salesman, not real important to the war effort, you didn't get a ration to cover all of your gas. You got a partial ration. If you were somebody who was driving to the airplane manufacturing factory, that's important to the war effort, you would probably get a slightly higher ration. But they actually issued a little card, and you would go into the gas station and you would hand the station owner your card, and he would pump in your allotted amount of gas, and then he would punch a hole in your card to show that you had picked up that week's gas ration, and then you couldn't come back until the following week. And so it killed a lot of pleasure driving. Nobody just went out on Sunday drives. Nobody went on vacations where they had to use their vehicle, so on and so forth, because they had to be very careful about how much gasoline they used. Artificially limited the gasoline sold. So if we do that, that's fine. Now in World War II, it worked because I had a ration card. So they were tracking how much I bought. You hang a sign on the shelf that says limit 2 per customer, or you hang a sign on the pump that says limit 10 gallons per customer. Guess what I do? I come in, I buy my 10 gallons. I go home. I send my wife out. She buys 10 gallons. She comes home. I send my 17-year-old kid out. He buys 10 gallons. He comes home. I got 30 gallons. I've busted through the ration by working around it. Or get this, buy a bunch of 5-gallon gas cans. Go get your 10 gallons at station A, then drive across town to station B, get another 10 gallons. Go over to station C, get another 10 gallons. Go to the next town over where they don't know you, get 10 gallons there. I could rack up a couple of 100 gallons of gas under the artificial ration of limit 2 per customer. So that forced rationing doesn't always work. And consequently, controlling of the price becomes the rationing tool of choice. But we can see what happens when we force a lower price than what the market will bear. And that's where we get into price controls. So a price control quite literally is when the government passes a law or implements a regulation that attempts to regulate the price instead of allowing market forces to actually set an equilibrium price and quantity. So why do I do price controls? Well, I do price controls for a lot of reasons. The most common reason is a price increases above a level that people are happy about. The people complain to their politicians. They use terms like price gouging. They will complain to their politicians and say, this is ridiculous. Gas is up over $4 a gallon. I don't understand why we can't get cheaper gasoline, so on and so forth. And the politician who wants to make sure that he gets reelected um, will push for a solution to the perceived problem. And ordinarily, the solution to such a problem is um, promote greater production. If you increase quantity supplied, the equilibrium price is going to start to fall. But very rarely do we see solutions where increasing production is the option. What we normally see is the government will come down and they'll go, everybody has a right to whatever it is that people are complaining about the price of. Everybody has a right to it. It's unconscionable that greedy corporations are jacking the price up. We're going to slap a price ceiling on it so that we can make people happy and everything will be fine. And of course, the price ceiling is designed to keep the price from going too high. The flip side of that is what's called a price floor, which is also a price control. This is where people complain about something not costing enough. And we'll talk later about unemployment and minimum wage. But minimum wage is an excellent example of a price floor where somebody complain, hey, I work 40 hours a week. I'm not making enough money based on what I think I should get paid. There ought to be a law. The government comes out and says, okay, we're going to set a price floor on labor. Nobody can be paid less than this much. So it keeps the price of labor, the wage price, from actually falling below that minimum wage point. And we'll look at why that is not always a good thing either. There is a video behind this cartoon, and when I post this video in Classroom, I will post the link to the video, the embedded video as well, because it's actually a pretty good description of what I just told you. So let's go into details. Price ceiling, highest legal price at which a good or service may be sold. Two things to know about price ceilings. The first one is if the price ceiling is set above the equilibrium price, there's no issue. Prices are going to center up on the equilibrium price. It's below the price ceiling. Nobody's complaining. The market is working fine. It's only when the equilibrium price goes above the price ceiling that the price ceiling starts to affect the supply and demand structure. And at that point, it will cause, price ceilings will cause shortages. One of the most common examples of price ceilings is rent control. If you don't know what rent control is, this is a process that a lot of big cities use to try to maintain low-cost housing in high-cost areas. And basically, what happens is you have companies that own apartment buildings, and they will have a rent on each of the apartments in the apartment building. And the cost of maintenance will increase, or the cost of insurance will increase, or maybe they just want to go in and they want to renovate the apartments and make them nicer. Maybe they want to renovate the neighborhood and make it nicer. And all of this costs money. So the income, which is the rents, will start to go up in order to meet these new costs. In addition to that, if they do renovate the building would theoretically now be worth more to live in. And so the landlords will seek to drive the rents up because of what's called gentrification, where you improve the style of living in a given area and consequently charge a higher price in order to draw in a higher class quality of people. So the problem with gentrification is that you have low-income people who are often displaced. They can't afford the higher rents, and so they end up having to move, or they end up having to give up their home in order to find someplace cheaper to live. And the cities started attempting to control this by putting a price ceiling called rent control onto buildings in certain neighborhoods. And rent control took one of several forms. One form was where you could not raise the rent on any existing tenant. So when the existing tenant died or relocated, you could change the rent before a new tenant came in. The other form of rent control is where the city would allow the rents to increase along with the inflation in the cost of maintenance, but they would limit the amount of increase to a set percentage each year. So sometimes costs would exceed the amount of increase in the rents. And consequently, what it ends up happening is the landlords, the building owners, have a disincentive to maintain the apartments. And you can see what happens here. I can't raise, so I've got my supply. These are the number of housing units that are available. And I've got my demand, the number of people that are looking for a housing unit. And demand, of course, is lower at the high rent cost and higher at the lower rent cost. Supply is lower at the lower rent cost and higher at the higher rent cost. Where those two curves cross at the equilibrium price, we find a $500 rent means that there are 15,000 apartments available, and there are 15,000 people willing to pay $500 for that apartment. So let's say rent control moves in. Let's say prices were easing up, inflation, and the price on rent was climbing up towards the $600 mark. And the city moves in and says, okay, we're instituting rent control. The rent control is at $500. Well, what you've got now with the artificially low price, you have a shift in your demand curve. Hey, I can live in a $600 neighborhood for only $500. Shift demand curve right. And now at that $500 price, I've got 19,000 people looking for housing at $500. I've got 17,000 of those 19,000 who would have been willing to pay the $600, and I would have had 17,000 units come available had I allowed the price to climb to $600, because my new equilibrium price at 600 is also my new equilibrium quantity at 17,000. So had the city allowed the rent to go up to 600, 17,000 people would have been willing to rent in that neighborhood at $600. 17,000 landlords would have been willing to create new units at $600, but the city slapped a $500 price tag on it. So the supply remains the same at $500, 15,000 units. But I got 19,000 people that want it at $500. Boom, quantity shortage. 4,000 people that want to live in that neighborhood at $500 a month don't get to, which means now they got to go look for $500 a month housing someplace else. Might not be as nice a neighborhood, or they end up having to pay higher rates that they might not be willing to pay, or might be upset about having to pay. So the city's rent control has created an artificial shortage in the number of housing units available. Now, it goes even beyond that, because here's what they found out with rent control and what makes rent control kind of a special case. What they found out was that rent control was put in place for rental properties only. Makes sense. Rent control, rental property. So rather than put a lot of money into renovating these apartments fixing up the neighborhood and maintaining the property in order to get the rent control price on a monthly rent. What the landlords were doing is they were converting the buildings to condominiums. Now, what a condominium is where the landlord still owns the building. So he or she still owns the shell of the building, still owns all the common areas, the hallways, the staircases, the elevator, the trash chute. All that stuff is owned and maintained by the building owner. But each individual apartment in the building, instead of being rented to somebody, is actually sold to somebody with a deed and everything. You own an apartment inside somebody else's building. Maintenance and insurance for that apartment are at your expense. The landlord who owns the building will take care of maintenance and insurance for all of the common areas. You pay a real estate price. So it might cost you $100,000, $200,000, whatever, to buy into this new renovated apartment turned condominium. So what happens then is the landlord would come around to his tenants that were paying $500 a month rent, and he would say, hey, we're renovating the whole building. When we're complete with the renovations, we're converting to condos. And as the current resident, you have the first right of refusal. So you have the option to purchase your apartment for $100,000, or if you turn that down, I'm going to sell the apartment to somebody else and you have to move. When we convert to condominiums, you will have 30 days to decide. And you say, but I can't afford $100,000 to buy an apartment. And the landlord says, well, you have 30 days from the day we convert to either find somebody that will give you a mortgage so you can purchase the apartment, or to vacate the premises. And more often than not, the low income people, vacate the premises. And so this results in two left shifts in supply. Because one, the supplier, the guy who's supplying the apartments, they weren't willing to open up any new apartment buildings at the rent control price. But even worse, they're now taking the existing apartments and they're converting them to condos. And a condo is not a rental property. So the supply curve on rental properties shifts left. Fewer rental units available at every price. And so by taking those rental properties off the market, they are reducing the supply of rental properties available again. No new rentals, plus existing rentals going away. New York City found out that they were driving an absolutely huge housing shortage with their rent control plan. So looking at price floors. Price floor, the lowest legal price at which a good or service may be sold. Price floors are used by government to prevent revenue damage in particular industries. Guess what price floors are also used for? They're also used to discourage people from buying a certain product. If you've ever walked into a gas station, they have a sign over the door that says cigarettes for sale at state minimum prices. The state has established a price floor well above the market equilibrium in an attempt to convince people not to buy cigarettes and hopefully then to quit smoking. So that's one use of a price floor. But usually it's used to prevent revenue damage in particular industries. And the most common one of these is agriculture. Farmers are kind of at the whim of the market. So a farmer starts out the beginning of a planting season and they're planning for their harvest in the fall. They're laying out a lot of money for seed and tractors and equipment and gasoline and all kinds of other stuff. And they can't sell their product until harvest. And so they go into debt and they are counting on being able to make enough on selling their harvest to be able to pay off the debt that they've incurred since the beginning of planting and still have enough money left over to be able to survive through the winter season. So what happens to say corn when the price of corn starts to fall on the market? Well, what happens is it'll start to fall in like June or July. The farmer planted in March. He can't reduce the amount of corn that he's already planted. He's kind of committed to a certain supply. But in the meantime, the price of that corn at the market is steadily falling. When fall comes around, he's looking at the price he was counting on getting, the equilibrium price that was available in March. And by the time October rolls around, the equilibrium prices drop down to half of that. So instead of getting $20 a bushel, he can only get $10 a bushel. And uh, the farmer's looking at that going, I can't, that's not enough to pay off my debts, much less have enough money to survive through the winter. I can't afford to sell my corn that cheaply. So the government, in order to salvage the agriculture industry, will levy a price floor. And what they'll say is, okay, the minimum price for corn is $15 a bushel. It's lower than what the farmer was hoping for, but it's higher than the equilibrium price. It's a good compromise price. Well, at $15 a bushel, that price floor is above the equilibrium price. We know that when it's above the equilibrium price, demand will decrease. Maybe some of the cereal companies, instead of buying corn, will switch to buying oats. Substitutes are available: oats, barley, rye, wheat, sorghum. Maybe some companies will look to Canada. They'll buy their corn from Canadian corn suppliers because they can get it cheaper, even with the tariffs, than they can at the price floor. Whatever the reason, demand is less than quantity supplied when the price is set above the equilibrium point. So the farmer sells what he can at the price floor at the $15, but then he's stuck with some overage. So we look at that. Um, he can't sell the overage. He can't even put it on sale. He can't even say, okay, for the leftovers, I'll take $10. I'll take $8 a bushel for the leftovers, because the government has put a floor there. So now the government has to fix its own problem. The government will actually go in and buy up the surplus corn, and they'll buy up the surplus corn at the price floor. So the government rolls in, pays the farmer the $15 a bushel for whatever he couldn't sell. Now the government has millions of bushels of corn. What do you suppose the government does with it? Well, the government does something good with it. They do something charitable. They load all that corn onto a ship, they sail to Africa, and they donate that corn to a starving African country. What do you suppose happens to the farmers growing corn in the starving African country? They were growing corn that they were hoping to sell for 50 cents a bushel or $1 a bushel. And whatever the starving is for, either demand is high, supply is low, might be a drought, might be, a storm went through and killed off half the crops, whatever. But that farmer in Africa is still expecting to be able to sell his corn on a market. And the United States has just come and dumped millions of bushels of free corn into the market. Slams that demand curve hard right, but it slams that supply curve hard left. Other way around. Slams that demand curve hard left, slams that supply curve hard right. And the equilibrium price on corn drops to almost zero in that country in Africa. So in doing something charitable, the United States has just put 1,000 farmers out of business in another country. So the problem with that is, even domestically, by jacking the price artificially above the equilibrium, we're going to create a surplus. The farmers are going to grow more corn, but demand for that corn is going to fall off. And the price floor being higher than equilibrium, by definition, is an inflated price. So it limits the buying power of the people who are buying the corn, whether it's the end user, the person eating the corn, or whether it's an interim user, the person using the corn as a raw material in production of some other thing like cereal or ethanol. We've driven up the price of that product. So I did not want that to happen, but that's what happens when you hit the buttons too hard. So Most common example of a price floor, as it says here, is the minimum wage. And we're going to talk about that just real quick. If you look at how wages work, you think of labor as a commodity. So labor is the good or service being supplied. Let's say you are the worker. You have a certain number of hours available to you that you are willing to sell to an employer for a certain amount of money. The employer is the consumer. They're going to use your labor. They're the ones creating the demand. And what the employer has is they have a job they need to do. The job is going to require so many man hours to do it. And they're looking at the price they're going to have to pay to purchase your labor hours to contribute to that labor pool. Now, we have a price floor called the minimum wage, and currently the price floor is set at $7.25 an hour at the federal level. Some states have higher minimum wages. We'll look at that in a minute. But if you were a freshly graduated senior and you were out looking for work in Mercer County, I can tell you that when I built this slide a little over a year ago, a college or a high school graduate with no experience could get hired as a cashier in any number of large retail stores in the Mercer County area for a starting pay of $10 an hour. So what that meant was the number of employees willing to sell their labor for $10 an hour was exactly equal to the number of employers willing to pay $10 an hour to get an employee. Now, a year earlier, it was at $9 an hour, and they weren't able to get as many employees, which is why they raised it to $10 an hour. All of these big retail outlets were seeking that equilibrium wage price. I need 90 people working for me. I have 75. What do I have to raise the price to in order to get the other 15 to come in? And that was the equilibrium price. $10 meant that labor demanded met labor supplied at $10 an hour. So at 725, the price floor is below the equilibrium point, no problem. But there's a movement in the country to increase the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. Now, while I can tell you that currently in Mercer County, the equilibrium wage is at about $11 an hour, we're still going to work with the $10 an hour number here. So if I slap a minimum wage of $15 an hour in place, that is well above the equilibrium price for labor. And look what happens. All of a sudden, minimum wage jobs are now 15 bucks an hour. People are coming out of the woodwork. You have people that weren't looking for jobs at $10 an hour that are going, you know what? I retired 5 years ago, but for $15 an hour, I'll come out, I'll work 10 hours a week, 15 hours a week, 20 hours a week to pick up that extra money. 16 and 17-year-olds who may have said, I've still got school, work's a hassle. I want to hang out with my friends. But you know what? For $15 an hour, I'll put in 20 hours a week. So you got way more people looking for work at $15 an hour. But the problem is the employer, the person demanding the labor, he's got a set budget that he's got for labor. And he might be able to employ 110 people at $10 an hour, but at $15 an hour, he can only afford to employ 85 people. So he's going to cut production, or he's going to try to make his employees do more, get more productivity out of his employees in a given day, whatever it is. But if you jack that minimum wage to $15 an hour, basically what that means is 25 people are now out of work because he's cut his workforce from 110 back to 85. In the meantime, I've got out of that original 110 people that were looking for work, I've now got 130 that are out there going, I'll work, I'll work, I'll work. 130 people looking for work, only 85 can find a job. I've got 45 people that want to work and can't. I have a job shortage. not because industry is not available, but because of a price floor on one of the costs of goods sold. So, in case of minimum wage increases, employers are encouraged by their company's labor requirements to pass that higher cost of labor into the retail price of finished goods. This is the unintended consequence of a minimum wage hike. People say, well, I can't afford to buy a gallon of milk because it's $3 a gallon and I only make $7.25 an hour. For the sake of argument, I'm going to say that guy works in a dairy. Okay. So he's making $7.25 an hour working in a dairy. Doesn't buy a whole lot of milk because at $3 a gallon, it's kind of expensive. So they come along and they double his wage, $15 an hour. Remember the three factors that go into determining production: land, labor, and capital. Labor is that middle factor. The cost of labor is added to the cost of raw materials, the cost of machinery and operating machinery, cost of utilities, cost of freight, cost of marketing and advertising. All of that is added up with cost of labor, and collectively that's referred to as the cost of goods sold. And on top of cost of goods sold, the company will add its profit margin in order to determine its initial price. Once that initial price is out there and the market is allowed to run, that price will adjust up or down slightly until it hits that equilibrium price. If I increase your wages, I got my 85 employees, I jacked their pay up to $15 an hour. I've got to take that $15 an hour, that extra $7.75 an hour that I've just increased prices, and I got to factor that into the cost of goods sold. And it's not one for one. A 10% increase in wages is probably only going to result in about a 3% increase in retail price. But the fact of the matter is, my wages have gone from $7.25 an hour to $15 an hour. In the production of a gallon of milk, the cost of goods sold has gone up by that amount of labor. I am now looking at a $3 gallon of milk costing me $4. So while it may increase buying power slightly, because it creates an inflationary factor, it does not increase buying power one for one. A dollar increase in wage is probably not a dollar increase in buying power. It's probably closer to about 20% increase in buying power. So, fallacy of price ceilings and price floors. There is a video embedded behind this cartoon too. I will post that on Classroom as well. But I wanted to show you this. Said I'd talk about states setting individual state minimum wages. And this is an example. These are 2019 numbers. I think the chart was actually generated in 2012, and these were forecast numbers up through 2019. And you can see how high some of those numbers went. But I want to talk about states and municipalities that have established those higher minimum wages. And I'm going to talk about Seattle, Washington real quick. Seattle, Washington decided that any business operating within city limits, regardless of the type of business, was required to pay a minimum $15 an hour wage. And that included a minimum wage for tip employees. So it included restaurants. So restaurants had to jump to $15 an hour. What happened to many of the restaurants that used to operate in Seattle? Well, some of them just went out of business. Some of them jacked the prices on their food products in order to cover the higher increase in labor costs. And consequently, higher prices meant fewer people eating in that restaurant. So quantity demanded fell off, even though quantity supplied remained the same. But what was more common was a number of restaurants shut down their in-town restaurant, moved outside the city limits, and reopened their restaurant outside Seattle, close enough to the city that they were still getting consumer traffic. So people were still driving the few extra miles to eat at that restaurant, but far enough away that they could still offer the old wage scale. And so what they did was, for the people who don't have a car, who don't have access to ready transportation, the employees who used to walk to work, who counted on working at that restaurant for their livelihood, when the restaurant moved 5 miles out of town, um, they couldn't get to work anymore. So they lost their jobs. So it's not always a positive impact just because the price went up. Remember, under total revenue, price times quantity demanded. Um, Total revenue is price times quantity demanded. Well, if the price goes too high, quantity demanded decreases, and even though the price has increased, your total revenue may fall off. A lot of companies went from full-time to part-time. So instead of giving you a 40-hour work week, because of the higher wage, I'm only going to give you a 25-hour work week. You got a $5 an hour raise, but your hours were cut and you're actually making $100 a week less. It's a negative impact. Over here on the right, you see some of the pros and cons of minimum wages. These are not proven pros and cons. These are just arguments that have been made by certain advocacy groups. For instance, I don't think an increase in minimum wage seriously increases the high school dropout rate. I also don't believe an increase in minimum wage actually causes workers' income to get above the poverty level because of those other second and third order effects that I talked about. But it is a summary of the arguments that are being used, and you can see more in the video. Thought there was one other thing I wanted to talk about. But no, that was it. So the impacts then that we see of rationing. Rationing, to summarize, is any artificial effort expended to change quantity or price within a market. The second and third order effects of rationing generally result in a worse situation than what the rationing was designed to correct. And so the final example I'll give you is 1973. Richard Nixon was president. Price of gasoline was sitting at about 23 cents a gallon in the early 1970s. It started to climb. It got up around 50 cents a gallon, and it was well on its way to 80 cents a gallon. And public outcry over this skyrocketing price of gas. The price had essentially doubled in the span of about a year and a half. Public outcry was huge. The impact, they were looking at the impact on trucking industry. They were looking at the impact on commuters. They were looking at all kinds of different things. And so Richard Nixon steps in and he establishes a price ceiling on gasoline. He caps the price at which gasoline can be sold. And he capped it, if I remember correctly, at 53 cents a gallon. Now, as I said, the equilibrium price was well on its way to 80 cents. He capped it at 53 cents. This did not change the demand. So the quantity demanded of gallons of gasoline nationwide was still the same. However, because the oil companies are sitting there looking at their rising costs and they're not able to increase their price in order to cover that rising cost, they elected to do the next best thing, which was to cut the expense of production. So they said, well, we can't sell gas at 80 cents a gallon. At 53 cents a gallon, we're still willing to supply it. We're just not willing to supply as much. It costs more to run the refinery than it's worth it to sell the gasoline. So they actually closed down or cut back on hours at a number of refineries throughout the country. And consequently, the quantity supplied of gasoline started to fall off. left shift in the supply curve. When the left shift in the supply curve took place, we started to see the supply curve get further and further away from the demand curve relative to the equilibrium point. And you know that when demand stays the same and supply decreases, a shortage is going to follow. And that's what happened. Gas stations started running out of gasoline, and you would see a sign in the gas station that said, no gas. And that sign would be hanging there for 4 or 5 days until they got their truck delivery. So the truck delivery would come in, gas station would pull down the sign, they'd hang up a sign that says gas available. What happened? Panic buying. Everybody that was driving past that no gas sign for the last week would go in, they'd fill up their car, they'd fill up their truck, they'd fill up their 42 5-gallon gas cans, and they would drain the gas station again. And now the gas station, they've gone through 3 weeks worth of gasoline in 1 week, but they still got to wait the 3 weeks to get their next ration of gasoline. So for 3 more weeks, there's no gas hanging in the sign hanging on the gas station. And then what that means is then when the gas shows up, the panic buying is even worse. Demand curve slams hard to the right. Supply curve is still hanging to the left. Equilibrium price is way up around $1.25, and the price cap of 53 cents is still there. The gap between demand and supply started getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And finally, the federal government says we're rationing gas. Customers are limited to purchasing 10 gallons of gasoline at any one time. Okay, great. So I bought my 10 gallons at the Sunoco. Then I went to Shell and bought 10 gallons. Then I went to Mobil and bought 10 gallons. And I went to Quaker State and bought 10 gallons. Wasn't working. So the government started slapping new regulations on it. One of them was, in Pennsylvania at least, based on the last digit of your license plate, you could buy gas on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or you could buy gas on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. So odds, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, evens, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. And you were limited on the day you could buy gas. So now let's couple that. So I can only buy gas certain days of the week. I know that when I get in there, I'm limited to buying 10 gallons. And I know that if I'm not there early when the gas station opens with a fresh tank, that they're probably going to run out of gas before I get there. So lines started to form. There were people that were driving around, they'd see a line start to form at a gas station. They'd go, ooh, that gas station has gas and it's an even day and I'm an even number. And they get into line, even if they're only down a quarter tank, they would get into line because they didn't know when they were going to be able to buy gas again. And what happens when people are pulling into those gasoline lines, and some of them, the gas tank's on the left side of the car, and some of the gas tank is on the right side of the car. So you got traffic that's pulling in this way to the gas tanks, and the one guy with his gas tank on the wrong side of the car tries to pull in this way. And everybody else thinks that he's trying to cut in line. They actually had instances where people were jumping out of cars and beating up other drivers because they thought they were trying to cut in line. California had a case where a guy got shot in the chest 3 times because he got into an argument over which one of the 2 cars, they were coming in from 2 different side streets, which one of the 2 cars was there first, because that car was going to get to flow into the line first. The other guy said no, it was him. And one of them pulls out a pistol and shoots the other guy in the chest 3 times over a tank of gasoline. So artificial constraints, not only do they prevent the market from achieving equilibrium, the second and third order effects are often worse than the problem that the price floor or price ceiling was designed to correct. Keep that in mind as you're going through the worksheet. If you have any questions at all, you know to private message me or send me an email, and we will set up a video chat to go through your issues. Make sure that you go back and review the first video because if you didn't go through the first video, this video is not going to make any sense whatsoever. And I will see you next time around.